Thank you.
I was talking about the tripling the size of my forehead, which was mentioned in the introduction, and now you have living proof on the screen here with the glare. And I was starting with a story from years back when we were in the Achieve days, going through a lot of change ourselves. I was in the middle of a meeting with a group of my colleagues, and I caught myself saying, well, once we get through this crazy period and things settle down again, and then I stopped and it kind of dawned on me what exactly I just said. And maybe you've had a similar experience where you think, well, once you get this new program in place, or the new structure is in place, or some of the changes you've been hearing about today are in place, and things settle down again. And of course, do they ever settle down? Well, no, and that really is where the light went on for me, and it's one of the key themes that you'll hear throughout this presentation, is this whole theme of constant change. I don't think that change is news in any way, but the pace and I guess the speed with which it's happening, I think has accelerated in the last little bit. So I'm going to go to my first slide here, which is looking at a comment from around about that same time that I came across, or I was having that experience in a meeting. I came across a comment from Warren Bennis, who's long been one of my favorite authors and researchers and writers. And again, this is back maybe 18, 20 years ago. He made this comment. He said, I don't recall a period of time that was as volatile, complex, ambiguous, and tumultuous. And then he quotes a senior executive of the day as saying, if you're not confused, you don't know what's going on. If I could do a show of hands here, I'm sure I'd see a few hands up in the air if I asked, do you find some of this confusing? But some of the changes that are happening certainly all around our world and throughout our organizations does get confusing at times. Gene Kerr was an American playwright who, years before this, said if you can keep your head when everybody else around you is losing theirs, it's just possible you haven't grasped the situation. That is one of the possibilities. So what we're going to look at over the next hour is I'm going to walk through a couple of highlights with you, and we'll start talking a little bit about thriving in turbulent times and building a bit more on the notion of constant change and thriving on turbulence. And then we'll get into optics and framing and how we look at things. A bit of a reminder for us, and I'm going to guess that for many people, a lot of this isn't brand new insights or ideas, but it's a time, a session like this, to step back a little bit and remind ourselves. Then we'll get into one of the key models, frameworks that is in my newest book that talks about our choices in dealing with change. We can either be leaders and lead, we can follow, or we can wallow. And each one of those three choices has consequences. We'll talk about what some of those might be. We'll get into a bit of a discussion around service excellence. As I know, as an internal support group within BC, this is a key issue for all of you. And one of my previous books, Firing on All Cylinders, had a simple little model. It was called The Three Rings of Perceived Value. And we're going to draw from that as a way of stepping back a little bit and looking at service through the eyes of those whom we're serving. Again, the glasses we're putting on, the optics that we're using. We'll build off of that and talk a little bit about one of the third ring particularly, which is the ring more of feelings, emotions, perceptions, and it really is the home of emotional intelligence. So we'll talk a bit more about what that means. Many of you being in HR, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. We'll touch on it very briefly and use it then as a springboard into our last section around some of the steps that we can take toward personal leadership. Again, knowing that many of you are probably familiar with some of these, a bit of a reminder perhaps, a review, and an opportunity to look at what we can be doing to move ourselves forward. So that's a quick look at where we're heading. I'm going to try to have a little bit of fun as we go along with this. I do a fair bit of work with healthcare groups, and I often will ask a group if they saw that study that came out years ago on the effects of humor in the workplace. It showed that suppressed laughter goes back down and spreads the hips and produces gas. usually don't find too many people that have seen that study or heard of that study, but hopefully we will have a little fun as we go along, and I'll minimize some of my dad jokes, which our family is always very concerned about. So let's jump right into our first topic area of thriving in turbulent times. And I know certainly BC and all across the country, in fact, I've just come from an overseas session last week, and the theme is the same everywhere, that we're dealing with constant change, and there's lots of shift happening all around us. So what are some of the perspectives on dealing with constant change? Well, for me, there's some timeless issues here. I'm a bit of a history buff. I love to go back and pull out lessons and how we, as humankind, seem to be going back through cycles and learning and relearning some key lessons. And so when we think about change and constant change, we can go back quite a few centuries to a comment that was about how life is full of these constant changes, and we need to let them happen. That came from the 6th century. Or a little more modern, coming a few centuries ahead. Here's an interesting comment. Social economic changes, uneven, unsettling, opening up differentials between groups, societies, spawning lust for wealth, envy, distrust of neighbors, overseas wars, unequal taxes, questioning of authority. The turmoil was worldwide. Boy, doesn't that describe something that seems pretty familiar? Well, that actually was a comment made, a description of 1780 by historian Bailey. So both of these comments, I think, remind us of the timelessness and the constancy of change. It is one of those themes that is life. Life is change. And so as we step back and think a little more about that, how can we thrive on some of that change and turbulence? Well, we thrive through personal growth. We thrive through organizational growth. We thrive through using the change as a catalyst to move ourselves forward. So whether, in fact, we do that or whether the change is deadly depends a whole lot on the kinds of glasses we're putting on, the sort of perspective that we're choosing, and how we respond. As I said in my opening comment when the light went on for me, there really is no getting through this crazy period to some mythical place of predictable stability. One of the things my wife Heather and I try to remind ourselves of from time to time is to avoid this whole thing of, well, once we get to this stage, once our kids are at that point, once our business is at this stage, or once we hit retirement, or whatever that mythical spot might be, then things will settle down, then things will be better. And of course, it rarely happens. So learning how to live in the turbulence, learning how to thrive on the turbulence, learning how to be here now and use this as a catalyst to move forward is one of the key elements. So let's look at this a little bit further. A couple of years ago, I ran into somebody who I hadn't seen for a while, and when I ran into him, I kind of remembered why I hadn't seen him for a while, and I said, "Hey, Phil, how's he going?" And he said, "Same crap, different day." Well, how do you argue with that? Because if we're walking around with our crap glasses on, there's lots of crap everywhere. In fact, we can really say that life is an optical illusion, that the glasses we wear, what we look for, what we see, we can walk around with those crap glasses on, looking for what's wrong, looking for why change won't work, what are the downfalls, what are the negatives, and certainly we'll find them, because there's lots of them. Or we can, of course, look for possibilities. A friend of mine, Peter Jensen, who's a sports psychologist and does a lot of the same sort of work as I do. He and I cross paths once in a while. He has a wonderful phrase for wearing of crap glasses. He calls it optical rectimitis. It's just basically a crappy outlook on life. Because, of course, crap happens. Whatever hits the fan is often not fairly, evenly, or justly distributed. Life really isn't fair in lots and lots of ways. But it's our choice whether to stand in it or not. And in fact, we've come up with a little acronym about crap glasses, which is taking the word, or taking crap, C-R-A-P, and saying that oftentimes what that really is we can't readily absorb positivity. So, really? So I've just been asked to flip back and forth from my face to the computer, and that's a little bit challenging for me to do. So I've got someone here that's going to help me with that. But I'm going to primarily be focusing on the slides. So we're not going to be going back, and then besides, as you can see, my glare off of my forehead is going to blind a bunch of people anyway. So I will be primarily focusing on the slides and moving on to talk about framing and how we pull all of this together, the glasses that we wear. We'll look at frameworks, and I'm going to have you flip back to the slides. Here's an optical illusion. And of course, what we see here are two dots that are exactly the same. I've actually measured them, but they look different. Now, why is it that they look different? Well, they look different because of how they're framed, what's around them. We could take a picture. Maybe you've done this, where you've decided what framing to put on the picture, what matting to put around the picture, and it dramatically can change the mood, the feeling, the tone, the texture, the color of the picture by how it's framed. Or here's another optical illusion. What do you see here? Give you a chance in your sessions to decide. What do you see?